The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
The most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Woo! 660 are having a concert. I haven't seen them for like 2 weekends.
Tēnā koutou katoa. This is Gone by Lunchtime. It's Wednesday, April 28, a special Pink Moon edition of our podcast. My name is Toby Manhire, haere mai Annabelle Lee Mather.
Tēnā koe, tēnā korua.
Tēnā koe Ben Thomas.
Hello.
And thank you to Jonathan Pearce, who is running the show for us today. It says, Jonathan, it says podcasts at thespinoff.co.nz on a piece of paper attached to your desk. Am I meant to read that out?
At all times, yeah.
Podcasts at thespinoff.co.nz. Big thanks to Spin-Off members for making it possible. We wouldn't be here today without your support. We wouldn't be dead. We just wouldn't be doing the podcast. A couple of big stories in recent days. Big stories. We've had the health reforms announced, and we've had the kind of rare sight of a foreign policy story in the big headlines. We'll get onto those in a minute, but there is one story that towers above all the other stories this week, and that is, of course, the site of open warfare, bloodthirsty, vicious, untrammeled, ruthless warfare between Jacinda Ardern and Selena Gomez, Ben.
This is incredible. This is the greatest celebrity beef that we have seen in the 21st century so far. Selena Gomez came after our Prime Minister, the Queen of 5 million. She said, "You've helped New Zealand fight COVID-19 domestically. Now we need your help globally to ensure everyone can access the vaccine." Oh! She did not. She took the 24N bus to Sandringham, but she got off at Trouble because Jacinda Ardern, the most powerful woman in the world, copyright Madeline Chapman, came back on her as News Hub, which is basically the world star hip hop of New Zealand political reporting, said. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern fires back at Selena Gomez over COVID-19 tweet. Can we get a few bars of this in? Can you give me a beat, Toby? Okay, Jonathan, can you put something over Toby in the final mix? Oh. No, keep going. New Zealand is a strong supporter of COVAX and has already contributed New Zealand's $17 million to COVAX to help fund free vaccines to 92 low-income economies. Oh! Coming with fire! Selena later, Gomez. Selena goner, Mez.
It was beautiful.
Okay, no, there's more. There's more. And recently we announced that New Zealand will donate enough COVID-19 vaccines for more than 800,000 people to COVAX for the distribution to developing nations with a focus on the Pacific. Whoa! She didn't just take Selena Gomez back to school. She took her back to spring breakers. Jacinda Ardern jumping up and down on the mattress going, "Look at my shit, motherfucker." Okay, finally. New Zealand is committed to equitable access to safe and effective vaccines globally. Calling it. Ashley Bloomfield is having a 1 p.m. press conference because we have a new COVID fatality. It's up by one child star. It's over. She's already dead. Stop recording.
There's nothing else we can add to. I feel like we should just sign off
wrap
now
it up
because
there.
that was just gold.
Yeah, I mean, so serious is the damage that has been wrought that Andrew Little had to announce a massive overhaul of the health system to deal with the corpse The health reform. I don't know. I feel like everything else now seems trivial after we've covered off that major issue, Annabelle. But there was, it's true to be said, that there was a health reform announced in recent days by Andrew Little.
I heard about that.
Part of it was that there are currently 20 DHBs. There was a big review conducted by Heather Simpson in which she said we should have fewer DHBs. I think she said 8 or 8 or 10 or something.
6 to 8 or something. It was a strange number.
Fewer than the current number. And Andrew Little liked that idea so much. He went even further, and now there are going to be no DHBs at all. They're all going to be gone. There's going to be a single health agency, Health New Zealand, I think they're calling it provisionally, like a national health service, and Māori Health Authority. Although with some real teeth, it seems like, as opposed to being a kind of little nice to have on the side thing. What did you make of it all?
Well, I think, all of us on this podcast have been critical of the government at times that they haven't been audacious enough in their leadership. So it's nice to see them doing something big and bold. I think it would have been helpful if some numbers had been thrown around to show that there's going to be some serious investment in health, which obviously we haven't invested enough in.
The budget's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see whether there's some proper cash being thrown at it.
There's been, criticism that it lacks detail, but as Little has said, in terms of the Māori Health Authority, it's being co-designed. And that process is still underway, which I think is a reasonable response. I think that, it's exciting to think that Māori might have a bit of tino rangatiratanga over their health. I'm interested to see, you can see how it's going to work in terms of primary health care. I'm interested to see what happens in terms of things like Pharmac and what happens when you end up being admitted to hospital and those sorts of things. But interesting times.
There was it was one of those. The response was quite overwhelmingly positive. There were certainly some detractors, but more positive than I expected. And a lot of the commentary ended with, as Annabelle hinted, but the devil is in the detail, or that there is a lot of that remains to be seen. The devil is in the detail, Ben Thomas.
Yeah, and anytime you're talking about a reform as big as shaking up the entire health sector, obviously there's lots of scope for things to go wrong. On the other hand, the direction of travel is good. The idea with DHBs and their forerunners was that you had local control. You were responsive to the community.
You love local democracy.
Even going as far, under the Helen Clark government, as where DHBs themselves were sort of established, having democratically elected boards. Now, anyone who's voted in DHB elections knows that's just a complete sham. You get a wall of, indistinguishable names. You vote for a couple who have doctor next to them. You rank the one person you've heard of last out of 30 using the Nerd STV voting system. And over the years, since those were established 20 years ago or so, more and more power has been taken away from those elected members so that now they're not even a majority on the DHB board itself. And the idea of splitting it into regions, which, all of these little contestable 20 different boards, that came from the national government earlier. And the idea there was, in keeping with the 90s national sort of ideology, that all of these DHBs would be ruthlessly honed by fierce competition. Good ideas would be exported from one district health board across the country. What we heard from the minister during his announcement was that instead, what we seem to have is sort of pockets of dysfunction that can't be reached by best practice because of this lack of centralisation. It leads to a lot of duplication in terms of things like, services, procurement, planning, asset management. So a very good step. There are a few things that can be improved by centralising them with central government. District health boards are one and local government is another.
The question of regional community representation is an interesting one because, like you say, the voting papers turn up and there's some pretty random people looking who are on there and don't appear to be well qualified. But then having said that, you get people like Jacoby Polaine in the Hawke's Bay who took a really principled approach over the Oranga Tamariki issue of uplifting newborn babies from the maternity suite. So how you strike the balance between making sure that the community does have a voice about the issues that matter to them.
I wonder in part whether
it's interesting.
In the slipstream of the COVID response, where people saw the Ministry of Health, which is not the same thing as Health New Zealand as a National Health Service, but is a sort of mostly centralised response, responding quite quickly and effectively, made this more palatable as an idea because it does still leave the threat that you both touched on of a kind of centralised Wellington, at worst, bureaucracy, who may or may not be in touch with the realities of health provision in corners of the country that aren't immediately in their sightline.
But, in the same way that we don't need a Starship hospital in every city in New Zealand, and certainly not in every town in New Zealand, because sick children, are uplifted and taken to Starship in Auckland, we don't need replication of services across the country. You can have, whatever you might call them, centres of excellence in different hospitals. New Zealand is a small country and we don't need to have this sort of level of redundancy, which also means that if you're not in one of the areas that, has specialist services, you're really on the outer, which is what they call, the postcode lottery. This shows up in a lot of cases. Mental health is one that used to get a lot of coverage. Jess McKellen wrote about how very long waits, for psychological or psychiatric treatment would basically be reset to zero if you moved into a new district health board area. Now, if you're in Wellington, if you have serious mental health issues, you're probably going to be moving around quite a lot. Most people in Auckland are moving around quite a lot. And going over the road or going a suburb away could mean that you put the counter back to zero. So having these things more centralised actually makes a lot of sense.
I mean, on that particular point of mental health, though, seems to me that the devil will be in the detail, and that the initial proposal, there's one page on mental health, so maybe it offers an opportunity to kind of reorganise it in a way that works. But
I mean, it probably only needs to be one sentence, which is spend some of that $1.9 billion, which has been sitting in a 12-month term deposit in David Clark's name or whatever the fuck they've been doing with it, because they haven't been spending any of it on mental health services or treatment.
The National Party response is interesting. Annabelle, initially Shane Reti came out in opposition to the establishment of the Māori Health Authority, and the language he used was about a two-tier system and fragmented. But then this morning, Judith Collins has upped the ante quite considerably. There was a press release that came out which used the word segregation in various forms 3 times, and she also described it as separatist, which is another. I mean,
I mean, the reality is that we already do have 2 different healthcare systems. There's one for rich people who can afford to have private healthcare, and one for the rest of the country. Reti's argument is one of semantics, which is it's about need, which is agreed, but the reality is that the most in need are Māori. So it's just, typical kind of... I'm not surprised by it, it's just National Party politics.
I'm furious about it. I've defended Judith Collins a lot over the years. I've been a big fan, and I just can't believe that this is what they're stooping to now. Just a bit of, speaking of semantics, just to get our terms sort of straight, dog whistling is saying healthcare should be based on need, not race. That's a bland sort of statement that no sensible person could disagree with. Saying that having an organisation that tries to lift Māori health outcomes is segregationist is just straight out race baiting. I think the thing that some people in National don't remember when they think back to the good old days of Don Brash and the 25% polling boost or whatever, is that Don Brash didn't win the election. And Don Brash got dumped shortly after he lost the election because it was clear that with Don Brash as leader, they would never win an election because they would never get centre voters. Maybe the strategy here is to try and crowd out ACT on the right flank, consolidate the vote, start looking like a contender again. But there's no way forward for Judith Collins to win an election this way and form a government, and she won't get a third chance. So I'm really confused about what's going on.
It's okay. Apparently they're lining Selena up to replace her. So
is it reading the comments too much? Is that what it is, or is it? I mean, it struck me when I saw that. I thought, this is the kind of thing you feel like John Key or the office of John Key would have just struck several lines of deep, vivid marker through those sort of ideas. Key
wouldn't have gone anywhere near it. When Key became leader after Don Brash, he started off with a series of speeches about child poverty. He did not go into race baiting, into talking about segregation or apartheid or whatever. And it's interesting. I think in New Zealand politics, since Orewa, because of the sort of tradition of Winston Peters going up in the poll when he race baits, and then the Orewa stands out as the sort of signal example. I think since then there's always been this kind of glass case around Parliament which says, in case of electoral emergency, break glass and, use the race card. And I think its effectiveness has been overestimated by people who remember that brief sugar rush that Don Brash got. It is something that Labour flirted with in opposition. Phil Goff actually did a sort of one law for all speech very early on in his time as
there was also a Chinese sounding names moment.
Then there was the Chinese sounding names, which is slightly different because it's based on immigration rather than Indigenous peoples. But it's something that oppositions will often sort of veer towards before thinking a bit better of it. Collins has played chicken with a bad idea and she's smashed right into it. And whatever the immediate consequences, the outlook for the next 2 years for going down that path is not good.
Is this because, do you think she's saying it because she's under pressure in terms of her leadership with the threat of Luxton and...
That's the only thing that I can think of. She is a smart enough politician to know that there is no basis for what she's saying. Saying that targeting Māori healthcare is some kind of separatism or outside the bounds. Healthcare is targeting. Right? We screen people of different ages for different conditions and cancers because it would be a waste of money to screen the entire population. We identify risk factors. When you go to a doctor and present with pains in a certain area and then they send you off for an X-ray, that's just them guessing based on characteristics that you share with other people who might have that condition, right? All of this is actually algorithmic.
It's a bit like saying cervical screening discriminates against men.
Well, I think even more so, it's like saying that prostate exams for
the over 55 or
over 55s discriminates against 20-year-old
the youngsters.
Well, I mean, in a way it does, because they get a different treatment. What you're looking at is identifying risk factors.
What you're describing sounds quite a lot like something called the social investment approach, which of course we talked about John Key, but that was Bill English's big passion in politics. And again, it did cross my mind. I wonder what Bill English would make of this. Segregation.
It's incoherent, it's nonsensical. This is why Brash failed with it, because there's actually nothing behind it, and it will fail for Collins as well, and we can only hope that she just like with her brush with being a devout and open proselytizing Christian last year during the campaign, she wakes up next week and just sort of acts like it never happened or it was a bad dream.
Briefly before we move on from that, it's sort of stark focus, particularly given there's some really interesting and seems to me constructive work that is happening from two MPs particular, Erica Stanford and Nicola Willis. Stanford on migrants in New Zealand and the realities they face in terms of what it seems very often an inconsistent, incoherent and unfair rules. And then Nicola Willis is looking at in terms of the motel usage as this proxy for emergency housing and the reality of the living conditions in those circumstances. And they're tricky ones because they absolutely do not demand very easy headlines, but it's important and real opposition work.
Yeah, that's right. The National has done best by just being a boring, normal opposition, pulling on the loose threads of the government's program, finding the inevitable problems. The government is dealing with a lot of complex issues right now, and there will be mistakes and there will be problems. And then you can make an argument that there are more than there should be. Nicola Willis actually got, I think, quite unfairly attacked by Martima Davidson when she first raised issues with sort of concentrations of vulnerable people in emergency housing. And Martima Davidson came out yesterday and said, actually maybe these places are not a great environment for kids to be, and they are causing some spillover effects, which is inevitable when you concentrate a lot of people with high and complex needs together, which particularly, former rough sleepers are, people with mental health issues, people with addiction issues. And again, it doesn't demand, it's not amenable to easy answers, but for a long time the government seemed basically completely unaware that there was even a problem.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The other big story of the week was Nanaia Mahuta, the Foreign Minister, and her response to China, or New Zealand's position on China, which is one that is under some tension and scrutiny as under Xi Jinping, China becomes, in the words of Nanaia Mahuta, more assertive and punitive in the region. Mahuta gave a speech to the China Council, and that was the thrust of the speech, which was framed around the taniwha and the dragon, or he taniwha he tipua, and which I thought was a new thing, but as Annabelle's going to tell me in a second, wasn't a new thing, a new framing, although it might make a fantastic children's book or great $500 million Amazon TV show. Yeah. That was the thrust of the speech, but then in some questions subsequently, in response to a question from the Spin-Off's Justin Giovanetti, in fact, Mahuta answered a slightly different question and repudiated suggestions that New Zealand was somehow stepping away from the Five Eyes alliance, which is, of course, primarily a security and intelligence alliance, and was somehow betraying its allies in that group. She made it clear that New Zealand had an independent foreign policy, became a little bit of a muddle. There was a lot of quite bilious commentary in the UK and Australia suggesting that the woke Ardern administration had abandoned its Western allies and was allowing China to get away with things. Annabelle, the Mahuta doctrine, if there is such a thing, she's still relatively early into her term as foreign minister, is predicated, as she's made clear in a couple of speeches now, very much on Māoritanga, on Manaakitanga and Te Tiriti values. Part of the tension comes up, of course, in relation to the indigenous people of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, and the extent to which she is willing to challenge China on those human rights questions, some of which she articulated in that speech. How do you rank her performance so far?
I think she's done a good job, and I think that, the reference to Taniwha and Dragon, that was actually something that Peter Sharples used back in 2013, and I think that, countries like China would, understand a culturally nuanced response like that, and there is value that she brings to the table in terms of how you communicate and negotiate with people of colour. I think in the UK they've described us as selling our souls to China, and there is absolutely an element of truth in that. We have, because basically our economy is completely geared up around dairy, and they're the ones who want it. I have to say, without a doubt, there's obviously huge concerns about human rights abuses in China. Having said that, Australia and the UK and the US aren't exactly shining bastions of how you treat people. I mean, look at the Indigenous experience in Australia, where they still have worse outcomes in every barrel you look in. The way people are being treated on Manus Island, Christmas Island. Obviously, it's not the same scale of what's happening to the Uyghurs and so on, but it's still appalling. The UK, huge producers of weapons. The US, I mean, we all know what's going on in the US. So I think they've got a little bit of a cheek to be calling us out over that. But the other thing too is, actually, those guys have completely neglected their relationships with the Pacific. And as a result, we're seeing more and more of the Chinese influence, because when the Chinese put money into the Pacific, it comes with seemingly no strings attached, but it's not that kind of paternalistic colonial approach to investment that New Zealand used to love to do. And so as a result, they're now worried. China's growing influence, all of that going on. But, I mean, they need to pony up, put some pooth there where your mouth is. And the same with New Zealand. When Brexit happened, the UK should have been negotiating a free trade deal with us. So they can't not pony up and then complain when we're taking care of the relationship with our major trade partner.
Yeah, and I think that there is a difference in kind between China and any of the Five Eyes countries, which is that they are a totalitarian state. Which is, that's a difference, I think. Unfortunately, as you say, they're our major trading partner. New Zealand's foreign policy really has to be kind of basically hiding under covers while giants fight, really, in terms of the geostrategic jostling between the United States and China. Nanaia Mahuta is right. Five Eyes is an intelligence sharing arrangement. That's all it is.
It's not NATO.
It's not NATO. It's not a federation of democracies. It's 5 countries with broadly similar strategic interests.
Spying on your shit.
So it's just, that's right. Sharing
reading your email,
sharing intel, and we get lots and lots of intel.
Yeah,
and everyone likes to know secrets.
Love secrets.
And in exchange for that, we can spy more effectively on the Pacific than our partners can. But it doesn't tie us in trade. I mean, if it tied us in trade, we wouldn't have tariffs on our aluminium in the United States, right? It's a bit too much for these countries to expect reciprocity on our end only as a result of these
the
alliances.
cheek of Australia. I mean, look at what's happening with our 501s, and then they basically accuse us of being disloyal by not sucking up to the...
Look, and in Nanaia Mahuta's defence, China is not new at the human rights abuses game, and it's never really brought up that directly. You know, Helen Clark would always say, "Oh no, we strongly addressed it in my private meeting."
But it does, I think it does become a little bit.
Russell Norman never got his flag back. I mean, there's just been a succession of indignities for the New Zealand polity.
Jerry never got his pandas. I mean, you know, what about that? I mean, to be fair to the Australian Foreign Minister, when they met, didn't condemn. She was quite diplomatic about it and said that, you know, the New Zealand and Australia were very much on the same page. I guess the question really for New Zealand's foreign policy more broadly is that it is a bit of a high wire act to try and, as you say, to mix a metaphor, Ben, to keep your head down behind the rock while the salvos go back and forth. But at some point, is New Zealand going to have to take a side? And that's the pressure. The pressure is on about whether or not that's sustainable. And the other thing that mostly went unremarked, and again is not totally new, but Nanaia Mahuta did say in that very speech that New Zealand businesses, New Zealand exporters needed to make sure all their eggs went in one basket. So it's a real thing, right? That at some point we can't have that level of trade dependence on one country that is, again, to repeat her words, becoming more, and we know what it means, assertive in the region.
We just can't afford to because it's screwing our environment. Dairy is screwing our environment, and ultimately it's taxpayers that have to clean up the water and all of that stuff. So, yeah.
Did you want to address the other Nanaia Mahuta project, Ben Thomas, which is the review of local government?
The abolition of local government.
Your other passion.
Her legacy project, which is a review into local government. And during her speech, she said, some people might ask if local government isn't responsible for 3 waters and isn't responsible for resource consenting, what is it for? And temporarily, I allowed myself to dream that she was about to say she was putting a kibosh on the whole thing. But instead it was just a review. And I am hopeful that the reviewers will sort of come up with a list of busy work for local cranks to get onto, you know, library redecorations, annual fishing competitions, maybe a parade.
Lovely parade.
Town pet beauty contest.
Maybe she'll be like Andrew Little. Maybe the review will happen and the findings will be, look, we should only have like 8 councils, and then Nanaia will be like, nah.
Just say too
we'll
many.
just have none.
Yeah.
And then a big fat Māori council on the side.
The Department of Parks and Sewage. That is actually one interesting thing, is that both of those announcements talked about, you know, co-design with Māori. This is the health one and the local government one. On the web page where they were talking about the review set out very clearly how it would proceed, sort of based on the Cabinet circular about, Tatiti consistent policy design, which is a circular that went around a couple of years ago, I think, to all departments and ministers, and gets adhered to varying degrees, I think, depending on who's doing it. But Mahuta has set out very clear principles for engaging with the treaty partner on the design. She's really, I think, 3 Waters was a similar one where I think she's setting a very high standard for consultation. You know, what we used to call consultation, but is actually veering into co-design with the treaty partner. And 2 of the 4 principles for the review were about the treaty relationship. Because in the past, I think people have sort of focused, I think, a bit too much on this sort of, you know, do we want Māori wards, do we not want Māori wards? I mean, adding extra useless elected officials to the current useless elected officials on councils isn't going to change much. What really changes is the engagement at every level with, groups who are sort of intrinsically linked to the natural resources in the surrounding area. And hopefully we'll see some movement on that for co-designing the Pet Beauty contest and parade.
I'd like
that
to
is the only thing local government is left to do.
They'll be judged by Selena Gomez if everything works out as planned.
I mean, Selena's been through a lot. She still loves Justin. Liz Justin, but there's a lot.
Sleeping with the fishes, Gomez, after Jacinda's finished with her.
This has gone by lunchtime.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.